Just so you know who I am, I'm a internal medicine, infectious disease trained physician. Most of my career I worked at the National Institutes of Health in both basic and clinical research, mostly in Africa and the South Pacific. So a lot of the methodologies we use were very dependent on using systems to acquire information in real time interventions, in this case for HIV diseases. What I'm going to do this morning is first on the whiteboard give you just the overall driving force behind all the project. And then you have a set of slides, and we'll go through those and provide some more details on how to put the system together. So what drove all this was the start of the H1N1 epidemic, and FDA had to release peramivir, which is an unapproved drug at the time, into the population to be used as what we call salvage therapy. Patients who were so sick that they had no choice but to use an unproven drug. The problem was I was on the receiving end, along with about 20 other people, being able to evaluate, does this drug work, and is it safe? And at the time, there was no system to do that kind of reporting. So all of us basically in the office for 24 hours, talking on the phone, looking for emails, all kinds of communication, trying to put this together and make sense of is the drug safe or not. And there was a small group of us that were determined that we were never going to work that hard again because it didn't make any sense. We had different methodologies to acquire information. And what you're looking at through RAPID, the real-time application for portable interactive devices, is one solution to do that. And it's grown into a recognition that for acquiring all the kinds of information we need for drug safety decisions or drug efficacy decisions, we need to have a systematic way to acquire the information. And the question was how to do that. So the key elements that unify the whole system is first, RAPID is a bidirectional system. What people send to us, we have the capability within 24 hours of getting back to them the information they need it, if they need it. That could be multimedia. Right now we've focused on QR formats and things like that, but it could be other kinds of information. The second thing is 60% of the system is going to be inside FDA, meaning that whatever information is sent to us, we have to be able to evaluate it in real time within 24 hours and make a decision. So when I talk about the system, it's going to be two parts. Information coming in on this side, how I analyze it on this side. So I just use this schematic just to help orient me as I explain what happens. FDA is in two parts over here. The two parts are, right now, RAPID sits in the AWS cloud. And for security requirements, it's separated from internal FDA by a VPN at the moment, but that will change over time. Two, if we're going to collaborate with people on the outside sending us information, there's two pathways. An individual can send a report to us through our portal, or institutions like a hospital, fire standard as an example, can send us specific information both for patient outcome or drug safety through a secure data broker to FDA. And the reason for this is if we want to do a lot of collaborations, it's not possible for us to accept multiple submissions for hospitals in real time. But if we have a secure data broker outside our firewalls that's cleared by our internal security team, this group can set up a blockchain kind of collaboration in order to accumulate information, and then all of us can use the data broker as a place to look at information and work with it collaboratively. So that's at a high level. So what are the different RAPIDs? So it's numbered just because of the sequence of development. So RAPID 1 was simply the prototype. We had to prove that we could connect all these systems we're talking about within the FDA environment, recognizing our needs for security. RAPID 2 was integrating the system and being able to accept different kinds of information. The three information sources we started with were adverse events, abbreviated AE, risk management evaluations. Certain drugs are controlled in the U.S. market. We want surveys to be able to accumulate information whether a drug is easy to use or not. And the last one is medication errors. That's where bidirectionality is very important. So that if a person reports that my baby is sick because of this drug, they get information back within 24 hours about the drug, which you need to watch out for. And RAPID 3, which is where we're heading now, is full production, for mostly adverse events. So any questions on just the overall vision? If not, we'll go on to the slides. So just in the first slide, so you look at the key RAPID components there. On the left would be the mobile phone presentation that collects all the information we need for drug safety. Now, the reason we picked the mobile phone as a start, it's not the only information input, is because if you remember during H1N1, it was the same time you had the major disasters in Japan with the nuclear accident and the hurricane. And all the infrastructure for communications collapsed for a while, except for mobile phones. So we started with that as our organizing device, so it's not the only one we would use for this system. On the right side represents what we have to do internally. And there are always two approaches we have to use with evaluating information. One is at the leadership level, what do they need to see to make a decision? And then for us as analysts, what do we need to see in order to find the right patterns and clusters of information? So what drives all this at the beginning of RAPID was a mandate from the White House. You see highlighted in red what we were responsive to, and that is developing an appropriate science base to respond to national emergencies whenever they occur. So that requires that a system be flexible, scalable, and be able to ingest information within 24 hours and make a decision within 24 hours. Implicit in that is the ability to acquire all the information of any format that's needed and to evaluate this information in real time is beyond what we normally do. So now, just in the basic structure of what RAPID is right now. It's currently in the internal FDA cloud AWS. One distinction I would make is that the AWS capability inside the FDA cloud is not the same as AWS outside, because you have to go for FedRAMP approvals for that. So for example, in a bidirectional system, right now we have to get an approval to use a simple notification service, SNS, or to get things out. Those are the kinds of things that we'd have to work with whoever we're going to work with to get workarounds of these issues until FedRAMP catches up to what we need to do. But the four key areas are listed here as a layer cake. And I think most of you recognize this model. It's a community IT model. And we try to mimic things that have already been proven so we don't have to be too much of a discovery group. So that would be that number one at the bottom, the ability to adjust a diversity of information. I'll explain why later we do that. Number two, a place to store that. So we need a scalable place to accumulate the information in the data lake configuration. And the reason for that is as we make clinical or regulatory decisions, we need more than just, say, text extracts from clinical trials. We need to know the chemical moiety of the drug that's being used. We need to know the population dynamics we've seen in the past with that drug class. So there's a spectrum of information that has to be in one place or accessible in one place so that we can make our decisions. But if we have all this information in the data lake, it has to have at least three characteristics. Scalable, which we talked about. Two, a place to test things. Because if you think about it, the way FDA works, for every new drug or any new intervention we do, it's a novel case. So we can't make an assumption based on adaptive controls that what we did last year is going to work this year. So you need a place to do that. And then the third part is that since we look at a diversity of data, you need a diversity of tools. So the capability to switch tools depending on your data or how you combine it will be very important. So for the analysts, after they do the adjudication, as we call it, of whatever we're looking at, we have to send it to leadership and say, well, based on what we've seen so far, this is definitely a safety signal. I'll use that as an example. So the top layer of RAPID is the ability to link with our federal partners, which are mostly NIH and CDC, and with what they collect, be able to, as a consortium, make a decision about what we need to do. And the capability is built into RAPID to do that. We have to develop it to a full production version, yes, but that is one of the things that we need to do for an emergency. So I won't go through the mobile app in detail other than there's a lot of different ways to do that. The key thing that we noticed caused a problem in acquiring safety information was if we make a person fill out the normal drug safety form, which can be as long as 11 pages, it takes about 40 minutes. And I can tell you as a physician in the hospital, if I have a person that's sick in front of me, I'm not filling out this form. But what we did find is you use speech-to-text capability, and in this prototype we take Nuance as the example, but I don't think it's the only one that works. We found it can do it in about 5 minutes. And the reason that's an important capability in the app is that the more people are able to easily input information, the more information we can work with to decide if what they report is caused by the drug or something else. When people truncate their information, it's more guesswork of is their complaint related to the drug or something else. So we're trying to maximize ingestion of information that people will give us willingly and quickly that we can make a decision on. Now implicit in that is if we get this information as free text, is there's got to be a tool at the other end to translate it into at least MEDRA, so that we can use our tools to be able to detect what the key patterns are that we have to look at. And you'll see some representations of that a little bit later. The other capability of the mobile app is being able to capture pictures and eventually recordings. Same with the same idea. With a picture, the capability would be, especially for generic drugs, if you look at a picture, we might have a better chance of identifying what the drug is. Because let's say I take penicillin. But right now in the market, there are about 300 versions of penicillin, and they're not all quite the same. So the ability to distinguish drugs would be very important. Second, for dictation, like I normally work in the emergency room or at ICU occasionally, if it got dictated, it's much faster, and more likely to get information that you need. So the whole idea is to make information acquisition that's meaningful but easy to give, and we can interpret it. And just the next slide is just an example of it. The test phrase, just in case you were curious, was what sold me on doing the speech to text was I worked in my early career as a tropical medicine doc in northern Ghana, which is called the Sahel region of Sahara. So we worked with this disease called onchocerciasis. So they gave me the phone and I said, I'm looking at a 34-year-old Ghanaian male with bilateral costochondral nodules due to onchocerciasis, and nuance captured it completely with the correct spelling, which most humans can't do, never mind a computer. So it's just the power of that kind of capture was very important. Now it turns out that Siri and some of the other tools are probably reasonably as good, maybe not quite as much, and there's certainly issues around accent and some cadence issues, but it's still better than a person trying to tap in the letters one at a time into the device. So we'll take what we can get in that context. So from a structural high-level point of view, everything I explained is in this next slide. And the one thing that I think is important to understand for all of you is that since it's a system, it's not an it. The ability to coordinate with a very diverse group of people is very important. And it was striking to us that we did this initial setup. It took us, I think it was 27 groups of people we had to meet with to make this bidirectional system. And the discrimination between groups can be very important. So for example, in our firewall structure, the team that maintains the outer firewall does not talk to the team in the inner firewall structure. So whoever works with us, you're going to be negotiating with a number of different people where we have to work with them, to get them to work together and talk together. But in many cases, you're going to be helping with us explain what we need to do and tell them what they need to do to execute this. Because we're beginning to realize that in cloud operations, Rapid is a second federal system within the FDA. So a lot of the things we're doing are quite novel. So, some of the novel things that we introduce, we have to help our internal people understand so they can regulate them or whatever else they need to do. So this is a very important slide. I listed some of our collaborators on this. This is probably about 30% of the people we have to work with. So this is a fairly integrated process, which is going to be really critical. In the next slide. Well, this is one of the prototype dashboards. Because one of the problems is it's great to collect all this information. Like right now, without Rapid, we get about somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000 reports a day every 24 hours for drug safety issues. And that excludes all the drug efficacy issues, which is a different kettle of fish. So what is the strategic way we have to look at all this information, and what kinds of information are really critical to us? So the way this is oriented, and all of our dashboards are set up this way, is one, on the left, you always have the parameters you want to control, what I'm looking at, and the tool I want to use to sort the information. So for an average pharmacovigilance approach, we right now use the Bayesian statistic approach in Empirica's Signal. It's not the only tool, but just the one we happen to use. And all it does is it flags the hot cases that are different from our past experience. And that reduces our workload for an individual from about maybe 400 cases every 24 hours to maybe 80 or 60, somewhere in that area. And that you can actually read and make a decision whether something is caused by the drug or not. So that's the whole idea on the left. On the right are other information sources which are newer to the internal FDA pharmacovigilance groups. And as looking at streaming information, and I'll come back to this at the end of the talk, but some streaming information tells us different things. So for example, if you do a screening of Twitter for adverse events, which we've done, or Facebook, we find that as an average surveillance tool, it's absolutely horrible. But if there's a severe event, that's probably our earliest warning sign that something's wrong. And then we can use our other tools and other data sources in order to get to it. which brings up another point. Implicit in this tool is we're using a diversity of different information sources and tools that tell us different things about what is happening or what's going to happen. So you have on the top right the streaming information. Those are some examples. And in the bottom one, which is probably the newest that FDA uses, is the geolocation and status of individual cases. Now, since we're focusing mostly on emergencies, the movement of new cases and where they occur is extremely important. If you know much about infectious diseases, you realize that for most infectious disease events, it has a starting point, it distributes by transportation pathways, and then depending on the transportation routes, so for example, say what you have here, if there's an incident point in Houston, Texas, what I would expect to see is anything along the highway to show up if it's infectious, and then it'll pop up in major cities on both coasts because that's where people travel. The pattern can give you at least a 2-day head start where you make your intervention. Now the added thing is on top of this, aside from just using where it is, if you use something like Esri ArcGIS, we can overlay on top of that, well, where are the depots for emergency medications, or are they close to the epidemic point where it started? You know, where are employees, and are some of them we can send to this site? And this can all be done within 24 hours rather than, 4 to 1 week response times that are probably more average depending on what the problem is. So it's the combination of these things that will allow an analyst to be able to look at the information and make the decision of recommendations to the management. And in the management, they have their own dashboard where when they go to Congress, they would have, say, like a pie chart and say, there are 4,000 cases that have been reported so far. This particular section of the pie says these people died, and we know that the reason these people died is this drug, so our recommendation is. So that's how it look, when we're working in real time. So the next 3 slides are just some specific use cases that just emphasize different capabilities. And it's one of the things that we really wanted to focus on within Rapid over a long period of time. And that is when you have a cloud-based framework and define interrelationships between collaborators, you can use it for a lot of different things. So its flexibility is going to be very important. So the use case I've been discussing is one with the adverse events in this slide. We have in regular surveillance, which is looking at about almost 2 million cases per year, the ability to receive the information, ingest it, and analyze it in real time if you want to. In emergencies, when you take more advantage of the bidirectional communication system, depending on who we're talking to, and that now you can focus the particular tool, depending on how you acquire the information, analyze it in real time, and get back to the sender information they need during an emergency. So that's the primary case we're focusing on right now because it's the largest one within our particular group. However, some of the other capabilities that we tested out were surveys. Now, this next use case is, as I mentioned, there are about 90 drugs in the American market that are actually restricted for use, and that's because of usually drug safety issues. If it's a very effective drug but a very dangerous one, like some of the opiates as an example, the physician has to do certain things to get the drug. So, for example, if I would give buprenorphine, I had to go through training to get it. That's a REMS requirement. For the patient, they have to have some access to a certified doctor, and they only get a 30-day supply. That's a REMS requirement. But in doing these things for 90 different drugs, you can imagine there are always going to be problems about how to do this. And there's no mechanism right now for physicians, patients, or pharmacists to actually communicate with us, hey, there's a problem here. So we set up the survey system to be able to do that. Now, this survey system is not a qualitative one, it's quantitative, meaning that the responses are actually designed by professional, for lack of a better word, social scientists who do how you ask a question to get a meaningful answer. And then we use a regression model to make sure that the responses between pharmacists, patients, and physicians give us some meaningful feedback on you need to change the way the drug is registered, or you need to add more tests or take away something. So it's feedback so that we can modify things. For REMS, real time means maybe a month or 2. That's still faster than what we do now. The last use case focuses on the ability to use different media formats. So the specific use case that I was involved in was the use of liquid Tylenol. In that particular case, we had a sudden rash of infants that were less than 6 months old dying of liquid Tylenol. So the question for us was what was doing this? Well, it turns out that in the particular medication that was being used, if you look at the spoon, I think if you have kids, you've seen these spoons with all these marks on it. The mothers could not interpret what the different marks meant. So they say, I want more for my baby. So they filled up to the top tick. Well, for that dose was fatal for a small infant, but great for an 8-year-old, but they didn't know that. So the whole idea is being able to capture that kind of information in real time. So if the mother has a problem with Tylenol, they say, I've been having problems with this, take a picture of it, send it to us, and then we can get back to them, this is what you need to do. But we now realize earlier that there's a problem with the tick mark where you need to do a modification of that particular medication and do it in a way that normally we can't do. It takes us about 2 weeks on average to pick up a case in our normal reporting system. So this truncates it to 24 hours rather than 2 weeks. The last one, which we're prototyping right now, is in an emergency. Remember, we focus on adverse events. Now, adverse event reporting, if you look at it in the whole spectrum of information, in the United States, we look at about 2% of 4% of all the adverse events that occur in the United States. And that means that we have to look at other information sources to give us a sense of drug safety. And this is one example of that we're doing in collaboration with the MedStar Hospital, Washington, D.C., hopefully with 17 other partners that are part of a consortium called the U.S. Injury and Illness Clinical Trials Network. And that is to use specific drug elements, health elements from an electronic health record, whether it's EPICS or Cerner, that indicate influenza as our use case. You usually about 80 things you look at in order to be able to do that and quantify how severe it is, what the cause is, and so on. That information can be automatically extracted from the electronic health records by the standard that we want to use. Now, one of the problems, as you know, is there are thousands of different standards. So for our particular emergency operations, since we know that we're not always going to be working with the same people, we're looking at packaging the instructions or connections we need to do using the FAST healthcare interoperable resource standards. So we get that package to them, and then they would decide, well, if we do influenza testing in my Cerner system, this is where I have to go to get it. And then what happens is when our system, which is called ESP, which is an open source tool, extracts it, it will transmit it to us through a secure data broker. And we can do this with any hospital once we have the defined elements we need to extract from the electronic health record. Now, the reason for focusing on electronic health record is it doesn't give us all the truth, but it tells us a little bit more about the clinical development of certain diseases that have drugs that we use for it. And I'll explain the logic behind that in a second. So there's a mechanism to automatically extract from either EPICS or Cerner signals about influenza. We would send it to a secure data broker. Now, the secure data broker, which I wrote on the board, is that middle box. One of the dilemmas that we have at FDA is that getting anything through our firewall is extraordinarily difficult. And in an emergency, what we normally do is we hire an outside contractor and say, we want you to collect all this information from any source you can get, and they can do it unrestricted. The problem is that in order to do that quickly, we have to ask an emergency contract. And the speed that we say an emergency should be and the speed the contract says should be an emergency are actually quite different. And we actually had some cases where the contract came too late for the emergency. So if you have a secure data broker that can collect information for FDA, and it's already been approved, means it has to have an authorization to operate by FDA, it can set up the collaborations through a blockchain consortium or other things to acquire the information. And then that gives us two options. That information can be sent to us as a packet, and then we can ingest that securely through an E2B transmission, R2 version we're using right now, or R3 we will be. Or we would access the data broker with other collaborators, and then collectively we can analyze the information and come to a collective decision about this information is telling us X, and this is what we need to do. And then internally, at FDA, we do different things with it. We don't need to get into those details yet. But the key thing is a data broker or some model like that will allow for collaboration with multiple resources, which is one of the keys for national decision-making for FDA. So if we're doing collaborations, one thought about that is in the next slide, where it talks about those 3 layers of things you have to do. And the reason I illustrate those is that, at least from a design point of view, since there are different requirements, it just has to be reflected, usually in the dashboard, of what people have to look at. So we'll take an example of the H1N1, which is a national emergency. What are the decisions that the people at the Assistant Secretary of Health level, what do they have to do? Well, since they're the ones that pretty much control one, as informed consent in clinical trials, should they start, it starts there. So there's information there that they would need to have. And if you work with a consortium, you can do that. Number two, what resources do we have on a national level, and where should they go? And that's where the GIS component comes in. And three, what other specific pieces of data do we need from the people that report to us to help us make a decision? And usually what we're finding is that you have to work for a long time with the people making the decision to find out, well, what do you do to make your decision? And it's not a particularly easy thing to do. So one of the things of whoever we work with is actually working with our decision makers so that we can reflect in our system what they need in order to make a decision. The middle tier, since most of the hospitals in this particular use case are going to be one of the intermediaries of the information, is what do they need to know? And usually in that case, it's going to be incident cases in the hospital. There are specific things in this hospital they need to change or modulate to control cases where they are or in a region. And so those two on the top are more case-level data, we call it. Cases, what is their status, where are they located, and what's happening to them. However, when you get down to individuals like Bruce and myself, we're now at patient-level data. So I want to look at the individual patient. Why did one patient end up with acute respiratory distress syndrome, and why another person didn't? And what should I tell my supervisor in the hospital is that maybe the people with that severe form of the disease, they need peramivir as an example. But in our system, we have to be able to generate that information. That's where the analytics come in for the raw data. So usually there's a lot of questions about what the secure data model is. So I give you sort of like a high-level view of what it looks like, some of the basic components of that, and then its scalability. I won't go into great detail, but we currently have that with our current IT developer. And the idea is to be able to adjust information. We can collaborate in the data broker itself, or information can be transmitted to us at FDA so we can ingest it and do our whatever we need to do. One of the slides I use, and this is just a thought piece, it's a fairly complicated slide for people who don't do data analysis all the time, is that what's happening within FDA is that if you were to look at the broad attributes of what happens with data, and this is from a guy by the name of Rob Wetzel that we work with, he's in the Department of Defense, as you look at what needs a lot of memory, big storage, big changes, or other things that we have to do. In those four quadrants, FDA probably sits down in the bottom left right now, and we don't have a lot of data per se that people think we do, and it's around maybe 15 terabytes for any particular object that we look at. However, as we start looking at multidimensional approaches to things, then we're going to start moving probably up in this graph, so you have to look at more speed of information and then start moving to the right. And once you start moving to the right in this particular graph, and I wish I had, this is almost a lecture right here, you require different kinds of analytics to be able to look at it. So our great frequentist approaches and Bayesian statistics were well on the left, but they break down on the right. So there's an implicit thing with whoever we collaborate with, that the analytics and how they change when you approach big data are going to be extremely important because it comes suddenly. Now there's one particular attribute of the big data issue for FDA that's maybe a little bit different. As opposed to a bank where it's volume and location, for FDA it may not necessarily be a large volume, but the dimensions of association are going to be much, much greater. So, for example, a person who's living in the Southeast and has a Jamaican background and suddenly takes a gold compound with rheumatoid arthritis seems to have an unusual reaction to the gold. And we know that historically the genomic structure, the genomic elements that we look at for that particular population, the HLA-B27 group, seem to be very different for people who have other groups. So we're looking at associations like that are not necessarily implicit, they are associated, and we have to be able to look at those. And then apply that context into a national scale. Because if you would say to take a Jamaican with a B27 flag on it and put it in different parts of the United States, you'd expect the same outcome to occur if you treated them with gold. And it turns out not to be the case. And we have to figure out why that is. And it could be that regional variations in clinical practice cause different problems. That's not normally done either with Bayesian statistics or frequentist statistics, so more high-level kind of analysis you would see more in the Department of Defense. So applications of those kinds of things will be very important. So the last slide I talked about information sources. So the ingestion of multiple information sources, beginning to appreciate, is very important for a very specific reason. This is some work that has been done by Robbie Harpez, and there's more categories than these 8 that I'm talking about, but let's just go through each segment because they each have a different implication. Now, where we sit right now in terms of rapid is we're looking at spontaneous reports and it's a 4% slice of everything that's spontaneous reports. So right now in our cloud system, we only have 2012 as our database, but we have to expand to the entire database, which goes back to 1965, and right now it's probably around 12 to 13 million reported cases. In each case, we'll have about 300 reported elements to it. That's the starting point. If you look at things like health records, which I talked about a little bit earlier, we're beginning to appreciate that health records aren't good for telling you the incidence or occurrence of a case. It'll tell you how they develop and why. So, for example, if I was to look at a health record, on the claims side, you'll see a patient is getting, by billing, ciprofloxacin for 3 days, and then switches over to azithromycin. It makes sense. Why would you do that? You go to the narrative side, and you realize that on ciprofloxacin, the 65-year-old patient got psychotic, which is very common with that particular drug, and they switched over. So that's what a health record will tell you. Not necessarily the case occurred here, but why it occurred. If you go to the health literature, there's that same attribute. We use NLP to pull out key safety information from the Medline resources. And what we're beginning to realize that that particular resource is very good if you have the right NLP tool to identify what we call marginal adverse events. And what we mean by that is that FAERS has a bias, that's the spontaneous reports data, in that it does really good at really severe, really rare events. But for common events that have certain subtle signals to it, FAERS is terrible at that. So if you do the surveillance within the printed literature, medical literature, we're able to find some of those things that result in not maybe drug withdrawal, but modification of the labels. Clinical trials is also in that same category. It's a little bit more complicated because the language used in the clinical trials is not quite uniform, but we're working on NLP approaches to look at that kind of information. Product labeling is particularly important for use in generic drugs, and the reason for that is you would assume that all the different drugs that were penicillin should have the same label in terms of what the adverse events are and those kinds of things. It turned out that's not the case. And to be able to determine which drug labels might have a problem, we have to manually look at each label. And if you recall, I said there are over 1,000 penicillins. So how do you get to that particular problem? The saying that this one label is out of the norm. And what we're looking at is doing a complete ingestion of the labeling library that we have into a searchable form so that we can get that information when we need it. Search logs is a special case. Maybe come to that at the end because it takes a little bit of a story to do that. Social media is not a great surveillance instrument for what we do, but it is a good warning sign of a problem that's very large, or that newspapers are causing an issue. And the reason that's important for us is that when we do our normal surveillance, if you see a peak, the most common cause of a peak for new reports are lawyers filing adverse event cases. So we have to be able to statistically remove that so we look at what's truly a problem and what's a litigation problem. Chemical and biologic stuff I'll do in terms of the story. And I think I talked a little bit about it in that. But when I first started at FDA, one of the most ferocious battles we had was with a particular drug called Avandia. And Avandia, as you know, is a diabetic controls drug, and there's a lot of argument about whether it caused increased rates of heart attack. Our approach was to use epidemiologic studies, but the score we would need to say we withdraw this from the market just wasn't strong enough. It was a 1.8, where it has to be at least a 2.0. So we argued about it for 2 years. I mean, really almost bench brawl kind of things. We didn't know at that particular time that in another lab in a different part of FDA, they were using virtual models of the heart. And in all the models, they test the different receptors that are on muscle cells that are associated with disease, and one is called PPAR5. The one receptor that this Avandia drug activates is PPAR5. So in the model, you would know that it would cause a heart signal, but we didn't know it at the time. So one of the issues around RAPID is that when you get information like that, there's some place for it to see it in one place, so you can assemble it and say, well, you know, the virtual model says this, the epidemiologic law says it's pretty close to being a real problem, and then with the combined information, you can make a decision that's more informed. And then the last one, the search logs, is a specific use case. That's usually done as a collaboration with Microsoft or Google. And the way that works is that if we have a large group of people that are agreeable to research, and I'll use breast cancer as an example, you stratify them out of all the searches on a particular range. We realize that for women between the ages of 18 to 45, there's a subset that all of a sudden has a stream to what they search for. Types of breast cancer. How do you diagnose breast cancer? What do you do if you have adenocarcinoma with breast cancer? Chemotherapy for breast cancer. Specific drugs and complications of that drug. And then survival. So what you've seen through the search pattern is the clinical construction of what a woman goes through when they're diagnosed with breast cancer. You want to know how it's diagnosed, complications. Since she searched for adenocarcinoma, you know this person probably specifically had adenocarcinoma, which we'd want to know. And then when they look for the complications of the chemotherapy, whether it's CHOP or there's a whole bunch of them, let's say they're looking for cisplatin, and that causes a particular problem with the throat. They start searching for that. I can reconstruct that this person had this kind of breast cancer at this level and got a complication due to cisplatin that's documented by our search pattern. So all 8 of those in consortium can be used to get a real three-dimensional view of what happens to a person in drug safety, or the flip side, if it's drug efficacy. The efficacy is a little, I'll use that carefully, in that we're looking for patient outcomes. If you do something, what happens? Efficacy means that it's better than something else, which you can't quite do, but that kind of information can be obtained. So the diversity of information, not only these, but others, are important to assemble as a collage of information so that the skill reviewers like Bruce and myself that look at something and tell our bosses, you know, in this particular case, based on these levels of evidence, it is pretty strong. We need to withdraw this drug from the market and be able to back it up. And the reason that's important, and I don't know if any of you had the experience, maybe you have, but sitting in a room and telling, you know, a company, okay, it's a complete response to this, we're removing it from the market, those people lose their job that minute, that hour. You know, so there's a lot of major things that occur, and that's why having the diversity of information that gives us an accurate view of what's happening is really critical, because you could drop a $1 billion industry very quickly if you make a mistake. And that's what we're living with every day when we make a decision. And that's why for Rapid, in an emergency, we're looking at a system to provide us that diversity of information, the ability to make some reasonable decisions in real time, and be able to converse with our superiors so they can make the major decisions they have to make in a regulatory sense. So in the last page, just some things that kind of summarize it. You know, it's a bidirectional cloud-based system, which is relatively new for FDA. It's capable of real time, and we're moving into streaming information. I didn't talk about that a whole lot, but that will be one of the requirements over time. It's flexible for analytic platforms. It has a place or a sandbox. Multimedia information analysis, are just beginning to think about it, because you get a diverse group of pictures. How do you analyze them? You know, what kind of regular approach should you take? And then even tougher, how do you sort them? Because you'd be